Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into something surprisingly dirty. Not just in grime, but in myth clinging to the corners of stone walls, wooden tubs, and centuries of rumor. Some say people in the Middle Ages never bathed. Others claim they soaked themselves in scented oils and communal stews of questionable hygiene. But the truth? Well, it's murkier than you might think. But tonight, we're not here to scrub away the mystery. We'll just wade into it. We'll step softly through steamy bathhouses and muddy streets, listen to whispers from cold castle corridors, and wonder, did they really stink as badly as we imagine? And maybe, why did bathing become such a strange and suspicious act? Let's begin with something you can't see, only imagine. Close your eyes for a moment and drift back nearly 1,000 years. We're standing on a cobblestone street. It's late afternoon. The sun is low, and the shadows stretch long between the wooden beams and stone arches of a small medieval town. The air is still and thick now, breathe, and it's not exactly pleasant. There's the strong scent of animals, horses, and pigs, mostly manure, is everywhere. Not just tucked away behind barns or swept neatly into corners, but right in the road. People share the same streets as their livestock. There's a sharpness too, like sour milk and old meat. That's from the market's vendors are selling everything from cheese to fish. But in the absence of refrigeration, fresh has a different meaning here. Further down, you might smell tallow from candles or iron and soot from the blacksmith's forge. There's smoke drifting from chimneys, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and sometimes less desirable things, waste leather hair, and among it all, people. The unmistakable scent of unwashed human bodies. It wasn't always overwhelming, at least not to them, but by our standards. Let's just say you'd notice the question did people in the Middle Ages notice it themselves? Did they care? And the answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. The popular imagination, we often picture medieval folks as filthy beyond belief, lice-infested, never bathing, and somehow content to marinate in their own stink. But this image, like many things we think we know about the past, isn't entirely true. Yes, there were some very unhygienic practices by modern standards, but people weren't completely unaware of dirt. In fact, they were often deeply concerned with it. It's just that their understanding of what clean meant was different. You see, medieval ideas of cleanliness weren't always physical. They were moral, spiritual. To be clean was to be pure in your soul, not necessarily scrubbed and sparkling. That said, washing did happen. In fact, it happened more than we give them credit for. Most medieval people didn't take full-body baths every day, but they did wash their hands, faces, and feet regularly. These were seen as both respectful and healthy. And there were other forms of hygiene too, like combing the hair to remove lice, trimming nails, and even using herbs to scent the body. And then there were the bathhouses. Ah yes, medieval public baths. Contrary to what you might expect, they weren't just places for the wealthy. In cities like Paris, London, and Prague, bathhouses were common, and sometimes even communal. For a small fee, you could step into a warm tub, often shared with others, where you'd soak steam and maybe gossip a little too. Bathing could be a social ritual or a personal retreat. In some cultures like Islamic Spain, bathing was a refined, even sacred act. In others, like the colder reaches of northern Europe, it was more of a seasonal event. But it did happen still. The bathhouse wasn't always the clean haven we might imagine. Water had to be hauled in by hand or heated over fires. It was rarely fresh soap existed, but it wasn't always used. And because bathhouses were often shared spaces, they could become hotspots for illness or worse, suspicion. Over time, fears of disease began to change attitudes with the arrival of plagues, especially the Black Death in the 14th century. People started to worry that bathing might invite illness. They believed warm water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to bad air or miasma, which was thought to carry disease. In response, some stopped bathing entirely. Not forever, not everywhere, but In certain regions, and for certain people, fear outweighed cleanliness. Soap fell out of fashion. Bathhouses were shut down, not for being dirty, but for being dangerous, and so a reputation was born. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let's return to that medieval street. Imagine someone walking past you, maybe a merchant's apprentice or a baker's daughter. Their clothes are stained, their skin is dusty, but their hair is neatly plaited. They might be chewing a minty herb or holding a small cloth scented with lavender or rosemary. They may not smell like a bottle of shampoo, but they're not quite the caricature of filth we've come to believe. And if you wandered just a bit further, you might find a wash tub behind a house, or a wooden tub set near the fire being filled slowly with buckets of warm water. Bath night wasn't an everyday event, but it was an event. Children were washed first, then women, then men, sometimes all in the same water. It wasn't luxurious, but it was something. So, was the Middle Ages a time of unbearable stench? Sometimes. Were people unaware of it? Not exactly. They lived with it, adapted to it, created rituals and remedies to soften it, and they believed that true cleanliness was not just about soap and water, but about intention and virtue. We'll dig deeper into that idea soon. But for now, let that thought settle in like steam from a warm bath on a cold stone floor. You are here, in the quiet haze of history, and the truth, as always, is more human than we expect. The bells are ringing now, soft and distant, a call to prayer echoing across a sleepy village in 12th century France. The sky is gray, and the church looms at the heart of town, not just a place of worship, but a force that shaped every corner of medieval life, including how people thought about their own bodies, and perhaps surprisingly, how they cleaned them. Let's step inside. The air is cool, and still candles flicker against stone walls. Somewhere a monk is chanting. You can almost smell the wax, the must of old manuscripts, and the faint scent of incense lingering from the last mass. It might not seem like the kind of place where you think about bathing, but here in this space devoted to souls, a quiet war was being waged over the body. You see, the early medieval church inherited complicated views about cleanliness from ancient sources, particularly the Romans and early Christian writers. To the Romans, bathing was an art. Entire cultures were built around it. Great bathhouses rose like temples with heated rooms, flowing water, and marble floors. It was about relaxation, status, and health. But when Christianity took hold in the crumbling shadow of the Roman Empire, it brought with it a different message. Be humble, be modest, be spiritually pure. To early Christian thinkers, Roman bathhouses with their naked bodies and open socializing looked suspicious, decadent, dangerous. They feared that too much attention to the body could distract from care for the soul, and so, slowly the language began to shift. Bathing wasn't banned, but it was reframed. Water became sacred not for its cleansing power over dirt, but for its symbolic power over sin. Baptism was the true bath, one that washed not the skin, but the spirit. This distinction would echo through the centuries. Church never outright forbade bathing. In fact, monasteries often had rudimentary baths, and monks were allowed to wash as part of their routine, though not excessively. Moderation was key. Too much comfort, too much focus on the flesh could lead to temptation. Still, medieval Christians did believe in bodily care. After all, the body was a vessel created by God, and keeping it healthy within limits was considered a virtue. But what counted as health or cleanliness was shaped by spiritual philosophy more than by modern science. Some saints were praised not for being clean, but for embracing filth as a form of holy suffering. There are records of hermits and nuns who refused to bathe for years, believing that neglecting the body was a way to purify the soul. Their lives were described as pearls of virtue, their sores signs of divine endurance. To modern ears, that might sound extreme, even disturbing, but in a world where physical hardship was constant and spiritual reward eternal, this made perfect sense. But not everyone went to such lengths. In fact, the church sometimes encouraged hygiene, especially when it served a larger purpose. Pilgrimages, for example, required preparation. Cleansing oneself before entering a holy shrine was considered respectful likewise. Hospitals run by religious orders sometimes included facilities for bathing the sick. The water might not have been clean by today's standards, but the intent was there to comfort the suffering and to ease their journey toward God. In towns, religious festivals might even include communal washing or symbolic purifications. And in larger cities, bathhouses were sometimes built near churches, even run by clergy members themselves. So while the church had mixed feelings about bodily indulgence, it didn't entirely abandon the bath. Then came the plagues, when waves of illness began to tear through Europe, starting with the Black Death. In the 14th century, everything changed. The cause of disease was not yet understood. Germs were unknown. Instead, people believed sickness came from foul air, corrupted humors, or divine punishment. Here's where things got murky. Bathing, once seen as a way to honor the body, began to look risky. Warm water, open pores. Open pores let in the bad air, and some even believed that water itself could carry disease. The church, often the first to respond in times of crisis, took precautions. Some religious leaders began to advise against frequent bathing, not because of immorality, but because of fear. Result, a long, slow shift in attitude. Where once bathhouses were bustling, now they grew quiet. Some were closed down, others were turned into brothels, which only deepened their association with sin. By the 15th century, bathing was no longer a widespread public activity. It became something private, rare, and in some cases frowned upon, and through it all the church continued to walk a tightrope. On one hand, it preached humility and restraint. On the other, it cared deeply for the sick and the poor, offering comfort where it could. Cleanliness then became an act of mercy more than a daily habit. It's worth noting that not all regions followed the same path. In the Islamic world, for example, bathing remained a respected practice tied to both health and faith. The famous hammams of the Middle East and North Africa thrived, offering regular ritual washing as a core part of life. And even within Europe, attitudes varied. Some monastic orders maintained washing routines. Wealthy nobles built private bath chambers. Royal courts, especially in places like Hungary and Bohemia, developed intricate bathing rituals involving perfumed oils and heated tiles. But for most ordinary people, those who worked the land, baked the bread, or shoed the horses, bathing became something occasional, a luxury. Even still, religion remained at the heart of how they understood it. A wash was not just to clean the body, it was to honor God's creation, to prepare for prayer, to face death with dignity. And so even when water was scarce or bathing suspect, the idea of sacred cleansing endured today. It's easy to laugh at medieval ideas of hygiene, but it's harder and more rewarding to understand them. They were shaped by faith, fear, and the fragile balance between body and soul. And perhaps in that dusty corner of history, there's something oddly comforting, even in a world without showers or scented shampoo. People still long to feel clean, not just on the outside, but deep within. Let's imagine a different kind of medieval space now, warm, humid, and humming with quiet voices. As evening, the sun is setting beyond the thatched rooftops of a bustling 13th century town, and a low mist curls in the alleyways. Tucked between a tavern and a cobbler's shop stands a squat timber building. A wooden sign swings overhead, faintly carved with a steaming W. Push open the creaking door inside. It's another world. The air is thick with heat and damp. The smell of boiled herbs, old wood, and sweat mingles with laughter and quiet chatter. Steam rises in lazy coils from sunken tubs. Naked or half-draped figures move through the haze. Buckets slosh, embers crackle. Welcome to the medieval bathhouse. Forget the grimy stereotypes. For a moment, these places weren't always dens of filth or sin. In fact, in many parts of Europe, especially between the 11th and 14th centuries. Public bathhouses were popular, practical, and surprisingly elegant. They went by many names in England. They were called stew houses, the term stew referring to the warm baths, not your dinner. In Germany, they were Badstuben. The French called them étuves. No matter the name, their function was clear. They offered warmth, water, and a bit of relief. From the outside world, let's look around in the front. There's a changing area, just a bench or two, and a few hooks for clothing. An attendant, often a woman, hands you a coarse linen towel. You might be asked to pay up front a few coins, nothing extravagant unless you're in a city or near a noble quarter. Then you step into the bathing room itself. Layout varies by region, but most share common features. Wooden tubs, sometimes lined with linen, a stone hearth to heat water, wooden buckets, or ladles and benches along the sides where bathers sit and chat. Some bathhouses had tiled floors, others simply packed dirt. Water isn't always changed between customers. This is a shared experience, but attendants sometimes rinse the tubs or add fresh herbs, thyme, rosemary, sage, or lavender, depending on the season. Not for cleanliness exactly, but to perfume the air and mask the more human aromas. There's no soap as we know it, but there are washing cloths, ash-based lye mixtures, or simple scrubbing tools made from rough fibers. Sometimes oils are used, animal fat or olive-based, if one is lucky, to soften the skin or ease sore muscles. In the better establishments, there might be a steam room, a small enclosed space heated by hot stones or charcoal, where people would sit and sweat out impurities, like a primitive sauna. And yes, people talked a lot. Bathhouses weren't just about hygiene. They were social hubs here. People caught up on gossip, discussed local news, even conducted business. Just as you might meet someone for coffee today, a medieval citizen might suggest, let's talk it over in the stew. Couples sometimes bathed together. Friends might gather for a soak after a long day. In some places, even meals were served, a light snack or a mug of warmed ale delivered tubside. It was convivial, and for many, the closest thing to leisure time they'd get all week. This openness had a downside. As bathhouses became more popular, their reputation began to shift. The blurred lines between cleanliness and pleasure, modesty and exposure made some uncomfortable clergy and moralists began to whisper that these establishments, especially mixed-gender ones, were breeding grounds for temptation. In truth, some bathhouses did become places of sex work. Others simply tolerated more relaxed behavior. The distinction between a bathhouse and a brothel was not always clear, especially in urban centers where regulation was lax as concern over morality grew. And disease became a rising fear, especially after the Black Death. Public trust in bathhouses declined. But before their fall from grace, these places served a crucial function. Think about what life was like for the average person in the Middle Ages. You worked long hours. Your home was dark, smoky, and unheated water had to be drawn from a well. Heating it required firewood, expensive and time-consuming. Washing at home was a chore and often unpleasant. The bathhouse then was an oasis. For a few coins you could sit in warmth, clean your feet, let the hot water ease your aches, laugh with a neighbor, smell something other than soot and sweat. In some towns, municipal bathhouses were even subsidized or managed by local authorities. In others, private owners ran them as a trade. Bath attendants could be men or women, often from lower classes, and they performed a variety of duties: heating water, preparing herbs, assisting the elderly, or cleaning up after bathers. Occasionally you'd find bathhouses near monasteries or hospitals. Religious orders that cared for the sick often understood the importance of warm water for healing. Some even included baths as part of treatment, especially for injuries or skin conditions. And at the top of the social ladder, royal and noble households had their own bathing arrangements, though rarely as extravagant as Roman baths. Medieval nobles might have access to private tubs, often large barrels or carved wooden basins servants would haul water and heat it over hearth fires and pour it into the bath chamber. These private baths were typically used less frequently than we might expect, perhaps once a week, or even just a few times per season. But when they happened, they were events. Oils, perfumes, and soft linens turned a mundane soak into a symbol of status, and even here, the experience was rarely solitary. Attendants were often present privacy. As we understand, it was not always part of the medieval mindsets. Oh, what did a full bathing session look like? You might begin with a rinse, pouring warm water over your body using a wooden dipper. Then you'd sit in the tub and soak. An attendant might scrub your back or pour water on your shoulders. Some used rough cloths or even sticks of birch for exfoliation. Hair was often washed, though not daily. Medieval shampoos didn't exist, but people might use herbal infusions or simple rinses made from rainwater and vinegar. Finished, you dry off with linen coarse by modern standards but effective. Your clothes warmed by the fire or hung nearby would be waiting, and with that you'd step back into the cool night, your skin warm and tingling clean, at least for now. It's easy to dismiss these rituals as primitive, but in a time without modern plumbing, this was luxury. The bathhouse represented far more than soap and water. It was relief, connection, even joy, and for a brief moment in a world full of labor and uncertainty, it offered peace. As the centuries turned, public baths faded from favor. People lost more than just a place to wash. They lost a communal space, an ancient rhythm of rest and renewal. We may not hear the splash of buckets or the murmur of bathhouse conversations anymore, but in the quiet corners of old towns and street names, ruins or forgotten customs, the memory lingers. Steam, soap, and a human need to be cleaned together. The fire has burned low, and the bathhouse is quiet. Now just the faint drip of water echoing in wooden tubs and the creak of old beams settling in the damp. Let's step out into the cool night air again, into a time of change. It's the early 14th century now. The bustling bathhouses that once steamed with chatter and warmth are still open in many places. But behind their doors, a sense of unease has begun to settle, in something invisible and terrifying is beginning to haunt the streets. First signs are small: a rumor here, a strange death there. A merchant's child grows feverish. A baker's wife doesn't wake up. Then it spreads in 1347. A ship docks in Sicily, on board rats, fleas, and a sickness that will come to be known as the Black Death. Over the next several years, it will sweep across Europe, killing millions, perhaps a third or more of the entire population. Panic follows, and in that panic, people start to question everything. How is the disease spreading? What causes it? How can it be stopped? Modern science hadn't yet emerged. Germs were unknown, and so people turned to what they did understand: the balance of humors, the influence of celestial bodies, and above all, the air. Bad air, or miasma, became the great villain of the age. Foul-smelling, invisible, and dangerous, it was believed to carry death through the streets and into people's homes. And suddenly, the bathhouse didn't seem so safe anymore. Why? Because bathing opened your pores, and open pores, it was believed, gave the miasma a doorway into your body. What once seemed like a cleansing ritual now felt like exposure. Naked skin, warm steam, and moist air, all perfect conditions for illness, people thought. So people began to avoid bathing, not entirely, not overnight, but gradually, and especially during periods of outbreak. Bathing went from being a healthful practice to a suspected risk. The very thing people had done to feel clean and whole now became suspect, and bathhouses themselves became suspect too. In many towns, authorities began shutting them down. Some were converted into brothels, which only reinforced their negative image. Others simply fell out of use, left to rot quietly at the edge of town. It's important to remember that not everyone agreed. Some physicians still recommended bathing especially with the use of medicinal herbs. But they often cautioned that it must be done carefully. Not too hot, not too long, and never when sick. There was also another factor. At play soap, real soap made from animal fat and lye was known and used, but it wasn't universally accessible. In some regions it was expensive, heavily taxed, reserved for laundering clothes, not bodies. The rich could afford scented soaps made with olive oil, herbs, or rose water. The poor, they made do with ash sand, or simply water. But as bathing declined, so did the production and use of body soap. Ironically, at a time when disease was spreading like wildfire, people bathed less and scrubbed less, not out of laziness or ignorance, but out of fear. Cleanliness had become dangerous, and, as strange as it sounds, this wasn't entirely irrational, given what they believed. You truly thought that illness floated through the air like smoke. Wouldn't you try to seal your body against it? If you thought washing opened you up to poison, wouldn't you choose dirt instead? And so over the next century or two, a slow cultural shift occurred. Bathing became rare, especially in Northern Europe. Cold climates and colder attitudes toward nudity helped push it further out of daily life. Modesty became a stronger virtue, covering the body, not just in clothing, but in layers of cloth, and fragrance became the norm. Perfumes, sachets, and scented oils took on new importance. People stuffed flowers and herbs into their sleeves or wore pomanders, small decorative balls, filled with spices to ward off foul air. The idea was not just to smell nice, but to protect oneself, and garments multiplied. Multiple layers meant more fabric to absorb sweat and less skin exposed to air. Linens were changed more often and bodies were washed. It was thought that a clean shirt could refresh a person more effectively than a bath. By the 16th century, there are reports of nobles and even monarchs who rarely, if ever, bathed. Take Queen Isabella of Castile, for example. It was said she bathed only twice in her life, once at birth and once before her wedding. Whether that's true or simply a rumor passed down by suspicious observers, the message was clear. Excessive bathing was not the mark of nobility. Even royalty embraced dry cleanliness. They changed clothes constantly. Their chambers were scented with herbs and flowers. Some even employed professional body servants to clean their hands, faces, and feet with cloths soaked in vinegar or wine. These were not people indifferent to cleanliness. They simply had a different idea of what it meant to be clean. And beneath it all was that lingering fear that to be too clean was to be too vulnerable. By the 17th century, the pendulum began to swing again. Advances in science, medicine, and urban planning began to challenge the miasma theory. Plumbing systems reappeared in cities. Soap became more widely available, especially in the Mediterranean. But even then, old fears died hard. In many places, people still avoided full immersion. Sponge baths, scented cloths, and linen shifts remained the norm. Well into the 18th century, bathing was cautiously reintroduced, often under the care of physicians or in spa towns where mineral waters were said to heal the body. The idea of cleanliness as a virtue, physical and moral, would eventually return, but only after centuries of suspicion. For now, though, imagine a world where the bath is a ghost. The old bathhouse stands boarded up, ivy creeping across its door. The tubs are dry, the fires are cold. People hurry past without looking in. They carry herbs in their pockets. They wear perfume to bed, and they pray not for a warm soak, but for survival. It's a world shaped not just by dirt or disease, but by fear. And yet the human desire to be clean never vanished. It simply waited, quiet and patient, beneath the surface of superstition, and in time it would rise again. Let us leave the dim streets and shuttered bathhouses behind for a moment, and step into somewhere grand, past the gates, beyond the guards, and through heavy wooden doors carved with coats of arms. Welcome to the heart of power tonight. We're wandering into the glittering candlelit corridors of medieval and early Renaissance royalty palaces. Might conjure images of luxury and refinement, and in many ways that's true. Gleaming halls, polished stone velvet tapestries, perfumes wafting through the air. But when it came to personal hygiene, even kings and queens were navigating a world defined more by superstition and symbolism than by soap and water. Let's begin with an image. A royal chamber, the fire is crackling low in the oven. Hearth, a wooden tub, round iron banded and half filled with warm water, sits near the fire. A servant dressed in plain wool pours in another bucketful. It's bath time. And no, it doesn't happen every day, or even every week in many royal households. A full bath was a scheduled seasonal event, something to be prepared for, managed. And most of all, witness said, base bathing for the royals wasn't just a matter of hygiene. It was political, symbolic, and sometimes strangely theatrical. Take King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. Though he reigned in the 17th century, his attitudes echoed centuries of tradition. Despite his glittering palace at Versailles and a court obsessed with appearances, Louis was not a fan of frequent bathing. He reportedly bathed only a handful of times in his life. He preferred being wiped down with scented cloths and changing his linen shirts several times a day. But here's the twist. The act of being seen to maintain cleanliness was crucial at Versailles. There were elaborate morning and evening rituals, the lever and couture, in which the king was dressed and undressed in front of nobles and courtiers. Towels, scented oils, and bowls of water were used to wipe his hands, face, and feet. To be clean wasn't necessarily to be soaked. It was to be controlled, orderly, presentable. Many monarchs followed similar routines. In England, Queen Elizabeth I was famously fastidious. She had a portable bath constructed so she could be bathed in comfort, though, again, not regularly. It's said she bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. That phrase, half sarcasm and half fact, has echoed for centuries. Bathing for royals involved a small army of assistant servants, heated water over open fires, often carrying it in buckets from distant kitchens. The bath itself might be a large wooden tub lined with cloth or padded with cushions. Perfumed oils or rose petals were sometimes added, not to kill bacteria, but to please the senses and reflect wealth. Privacy, as we understand it today, was not a given. Even a royal bath was attended by valets, chambermaids, and personal physicians. In some cases, it was considered improper for a ruler to be entirely alone, even while bathing. In Central and Eastern Europe, bathing remained more prominent among the elite longer than in other parts of Europe. In Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia, rulers maintained large bathhouses within their castles, often influenced by Ottoman and Byzantine traditions. Heated rooms, steam chambers, and even tiled baths with flowing water could be found in royal residences. One example is King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who ruled in the 15th century. He was known for having a Renaissance court that embraced learning, refinement, and bathing. His palace at Visegrad had a dedicated bath wing complete with geometric tiles, drainage systems, and hot water facilities. Still, these were exceptions. In most royal courts, regular full-body bathing declined through the late medieval period. Instead, the focus shifted to scented self-maintenance. Changing into fresh linen, especially undergarments, became a substitute for washing. The logic was that linen absorbed dirt and sweat, and replacing it refreshed the body. In some accounts, nobles changed their linens multiple times a day. This practice wasn't entirely misguided. In the absence of antibacterial soap or running water, friction from linen and air circulation helped prevent skin infections. It wasn't bathing, but it wasn't entirely ineffective either. Then there were perfumes. The royal courts of France, Italy, and Spain became hotbeds of fragrance innovation. Scented gloves, powdered wigs, rose water for the hands, lavender sachets in the pockets. These became tools of personal maintenance. But underneath the layers of silk, lace, and luxury was a layer of skin that rarely touched water. Interestingly, when royals did bathe, it was often for symbolic or ceremonial reasons. For instance, before coronations, it was customary in some traditions for monarchs to undergo a ritual cleansing meant to purify them before receiving the divine right to rule. These royal baths were performed with great care, often in special tubs, using water infused with herbs, and sometimes even precious materials like gold flakes or crushed pearls. And yet the actual medical advice varied. Royal physicians sometimes discouraged bathing, entirely fearing it would unbalance the humors or weaken the body. Instead, they recommended wine or vinegar rubs, dry brushing and oiling the skin. In court records, you'll find accounts of kings being massaged with spiced oils and scraped with special tools. Not unlike a dry spa treatment today, there's also a darker side to this cleanliness. Gap, because royals and nobles had more access to scented powders and fabric changes. Their lack of actual bathing didn't always smell as obvious as it might among the poor. The illusion of cleanliness could be maintained, but underneath it all, issues like lice, skin infections, and even open sores were common even among queens and kings. Take, for instance, Henry IV of France. His hygiene, or lack thereof, was legendary. His courtiers were known to faint from his odor, and yet he was adored by his subjects. Cleanliness clearly was not always linked with charisma still. The notion that bathing was unroyal wasn't universal. In the Islamic courts of Al-Andalus, for example, rulers maintained lavish hammams, public bathhouses modeled on Roman and Persian designs. Caliphs and emirs bathed frequently, not only for cleanliness, but as part of religious and cultural ritual. Their courts were fragrant with oils, incense, and the gentle sound of flowing water. Some of this influence even reached European courts during periods of trade or crusade, and later during the Renaissance. Renewed interest in classical antiquity began to shift attitudes once again. The idea of bathing as both an aesthetic and healthful practice began its slow return, led ironically by those who had once abandoned it. Still, the medieval centuries remained a strange in-between for royalty. Bathing was never truly forgotten, but it was altered, ritualized, and restrained. It wasn't about getting clean. It was about being seen: a freshly scented shirt, a carefully wiped brow, a velvet glove dabbed with rose oil. These gestures became the hallmarks of noble hygiene. While the servants may have had fewer options, they often bathed more frequently, simply because they did the work. They filled the tubs, they hauled the water, and in the quiet corners of the palace, after the nobles had gone to bed, they may have dipped their hands into the leftover warmth. So, the next time you imagine a king sitting on a golden throne, think too of the tub, the steam, the servants, the scent of thyme in the air. Cleanliness, like power, was always complicated. Now let's leave the palaces behind, the velvet, the gold-threaded robes, the rose-scented gloves, and step down into the world of the ordinary. Footpath winds through fields of barley and rye. Chickens scatter. A wooden plow rests by the hedgerow, and in the distance you can see the smoke curling from a low thatched cottage, barely tall enough for a grown man to stand upright inside. This is where the vast majority of medieval people lived, not in castles, not in manor houses, but in one-room homes built from wattle and daub twigs, mud, straw, and whatever could be gathered. Yet in this humble setting, the story of medieval bathing and hygiene becomes even more human-led. As step inside, there's no bathroom, of course, no plumbing, just a packed earth floor, a small hearth in the middle of the room, and maybe a wooden bench or low stool. The walls are dark with smoke from years of cooking over open flame. It smells of firewood, old rushes, and people sweat leather, sour milk, and perhaps a bit of soapious soap. Contrary to popular belief, peasants did make and use soap, though it wasn't the perfumed milled bars of later centuries. Instead, it was rough lye-based soap made from wood, ash, and animal fat. It was coarse, harsh on the skin, and used sparingly, but it worked especially for laundering clothes. As for bathing, it happened. Not often and not easily, but it did happen. Let's begin with the basics. Water. Fetching water was a daily task often assigned to women or children. Buckets were filled from wells, streams, or communal fountains. Sometimes a long walk from home Water was precious, heavy, time-consuming to gather too. Use it for bathing meant sacrificing it for other things: drinking, cooking, washing dishes, or feeding livestock and heating it. That required firewood, which had to be collected, chopped, or purchased in winter. It was a luxury still peasants understood the need for cleanliness, especially in a practical sense. Washing hands and faces happened daily, before meals, after work, often at the door of the house or near a small basin. Children were taught to rinse their fingers and splash their faces in cold water, sometimes scented with herbs or vinegar. If available, feet too were washed, often especially after long days in fields or muddy roads. Foot infections were common, and care was taken to avoid wounds, especially in colder months, and then occasionally, perhaps once a week or once every few weeks, depending on the season. Full body bath. This would usually take place in a wooden tub. Nothing fancy. Maybe a beer barrel cut in half, or a low wash tub meant for laundry. It was brought near the hearth, filled with buckets of warm water, and used in stages. The children went in first, then the women, then the men, all in the same water. Phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," comes from this very practice. By the time the man of the house finished his soak, the water might be nearly black, but that was the routine. Efficient, economical, privacy was minimal. In a one-room house, bathing was communal routine, unremarkable. Embarrassment didn't factor in. The body wasn't romanticized. It was just another tool to be cared for, like a plow or a kettle in. Some peasants bathed outside in rivers, ponds, or barrels, left to warm in the sun. Whole families might take a dip, especially during festivals or holy days. On certain feast days, communal washing was encouraged. Yes, there were even village bathhouses in some regions, simple structures run by local tradespeople, offering warm tubs for a small fee. They weren't luxurious, but they offered a rare comfort. Time to soak, to rest, to be clean. Clothing played a key role too. Peasants owned few garments, maybe one or two sets of clothing total, but linen shifts and underclothes were changed and washed more regularly than outer layers. Linen, with its tight weave, was more comfortable against the skin and more absorbent than wool shirts. And shifts were scrubbed in basins or streams using ash, soap, and stones. They were hung to dry on bushes or over fences, left to bleach in the sun. A clean shirt was not just a sign of respectability. It was a relief in the heat, a layer of protection. In the cold, and hair that depended, peasant women often wore their hair in braids or under cloth. Caps. Men kept it short or tucked under hoods. Lice and fleas were common, and combing was essential. Special combs, often fine-toothed and carved from bone, were used to remove vermin and dirt. Herbs like rosemary or lavender were steeped into rinses. Vinegar was used to clean the scalp. Was it effective? Not entirely, but it was better than nothing. And the truth is, peasants noticed bad smells. They noticed disease. They understood on some instinctual level that filth could bring illness. Even if they didn't understand germs, they saw the patterns in times of plague. It was often the poor who were blamed first. Their supposed dirtiness made them easy scapegoats. But in truth, it was often their crowded conditions, lack of access to clean water, and minimal medical care that put them most at risk. Still, many communities developed their own systems. Villages had washing days times, when families gathered near streams or wells to clean clothes and linens together. Herbal knowledge was passed down through generations. How to boil thyme to treat a rash, or how to make a poultice for a wound. Elders taught children how to wash, how to care for their teeth using twigs or ash, how to use mint to freshen breath or sage to treat a sore throat. Hygiene was part of life, folded into the rhythm of survival. So no peasants were not wallowing in filth, blissfully unaware. They were resourceful, careful, and often cleaner than the nobles above them, who had more perfume than water. Imagine it now, a cold morning. A young girl crouches by the hearth, wringing out a cloth soaked in warm water and vinegar. She wipes her brother's Face then scrubs his hands. Outside, her father pours water into a wooden basin and washes his feet steam, rising into the crisp air. They are poor, but they are not careless. They make do because in a world where water must be carried, firewood chopped. And every task done by hand cleanliness is not just about luxury, it's about dignity. Let's take a moment to slow down even further. The air is still. The flicker of firelight plays along the rough wooden beams of a medieval cottage. Outside, a light drizzle dampens the dirt path, and the leaves shimmer with droplets like little beads of glass inside. However, something curious is happening on a small wooden table, uneven, scarred from years of use. An old woman bends over a mortar and pestle. Her fingers are stained green. Her eyes are sharp. She crushes dried rosemary into powder, then adds it to a pot of boiling water set over the hearth. The mixture hisses as it simmers, releasing a deep, earthy scent. It fills the room. This is not a scene of magic. Not quite. But to the people of the Middle Ages, it might as well have been, because in a world before pharmacies and perfumeries, herbs were everything: cleanliness, health, even spiritual balance. They were all thought to rest in part in the careful use of the natural world, and so across Europe, peasants and nobles alike turned to herbal remedies and handmade solutions for bathing, cleansing, and keeping their bodies in harmony. Let's explore what they used and how. First, herbs for washing. Most common were those that could be grown in kitchen gardens or found along the edge of forests and fields. Lavender, for instance, was prized for its sweet scent and calming properties. People steeped the dried flowers in hot water to make rinses for their faces or hair. Some even tucked sprigs into their linen chests to keep clothes smelling fresh, or as fresh as they could be in a world without detergent. Rosemary was another staple, often boiled and used as a sort of antiseptic rinse. It was thought to drive out bad humors, and some women would rub it into their hair to promote growth and shinement. Especially spearmint was chewed to freshen the breath, or steeped into warm foot baths to soothe tired legs. Chamomile, with its gentle apple-like fragrance, was used in soaps and salves believed to soften skin and calm inflammation. And then there was sage, used for everything from mouthwash to healing wounds. Sage boiled in vinegar was used to treat ulcers or applied to feet to ease sores after long days of walking. Now, let's talk about the bath itself. If a family had the means and the firewood, they might prepare an herbal bath by tossing handfuls of dried leaves into the tub. Not for the luxury of it, but to cleanse the skin, soothe itches, or keep away lice and fleas. Imagine sinking into warm water scented with thyme, bay leaves, and calendula steam, rising around you, the scent of crushed greenery wrapping your senses. It wouldn't be glamorous, it wouldn't be private, but it would be grounding, comforting, a rare moment of stillness. Sometimes, especially during illness or pregnancy, these herbal baths were prepared with great care. Midwives and wise women guarded these recipes, carefully passed down through generations, adjusted with every season. And what about soap? Yes, let's not forget the humble bar of medieval soap, a far cry from the silky perfumed kinds we know today. Soap in the Middle Ages was functional. It wasn't about lathering up for a spa day. It was about cutting through grime, scrubbing off sweat, and rinsing away whatever dirt clung to skin and cloth. The basic recipe: animal fat, usually from sheep or pigs, melted down and mixed with lye, which was made from wood ash and water. This created a gritty, sometimes caustic mixture that could clean, yes, but also irritate if used too frequently. Some pars or soapers existed in most towns. They often doubled as candle makers, since both crafts used tallow. Town records from cities like London and Paris mention soap production as early as the 12th century. In some areas, soap was even regulated. Certain towns demanded it be made with olive oil instead of animal fat, especially in southern Europe, where such oils were more available. Richer households could afford imported Castile soap, a smoother, milder blend made from olive oil, prized for its quality. It came from the Castile region of Spain and was considered a luxury item. But for most people, soap was homemade. Family might make a small batch once a year during the autumn slaughter, when animal fat was abundant. The process was dangerous. Lye could burn the skin, but it was essential. Once the soap had set, it was cut into chunks and stored for use on laundry dishes or on special occasions. The body clothes, too, were soaked with a mix of soap shavings and hot water, then scrub it on boards or beaten with paddles near a stream. Sometimes herbs were added to scent the fabric or simply to mask the smell of damp wool. Tooth care was another arena of medieval cleanliness that involved clever uses of herbs and mineral. To brush their teeth, people used chewing sticks, small twigs from trees like walnut or licorice, which frayed at one end when chewed and acted like a rudimentary toothbrush. Some rubbed their teeth with a mixture of crushed charcoal salt and mint leaves. Not gentle perhaps, but surprisingly effective at scrubbing away plaque breath. Fresheners, parsley, cloves, even cinnamon sticks. Richer folks might chew cardamom or aniseed. Wow. The poor made do with wild mint. And don't forget the ritual aspect of cleanliness. Bathing wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. In medieval Christianity, water symbolized purity. Many monasteries were built with running water channels, where monks washed not just their hands and faces, but their souls in ritual. Cleansing pilgrims washed before approaching holy sites. Knights were bathed before being dubbed, scrubbed clean of their past, to emerge as noble protectors. And babies were washed during baptism, not just for cleanliness, but for sanctification. In Islamic regions of medieval Spain and the Middle East, this connection was even stronger. Ritual washing wood was practiced multiple times a day before prayer. In these cultures, public bathhouses flourished, and the link between spiritual and physical hygiene was deeply respected. Let's return now to that cottage. The old woman by the hearth ladles her rosemary brew into a small clay bowl. She dips a cloth into the steaming liquid and wrings it out slowly, her hands weathered but precise. She presses the cloth to her grandson's back, wiping away the sweat from a summer day in the fields. He winces at first, but then exhales. The warmth seeps in the scent, clears his nose, and for a moment, the hardships of life, muddy roads, worn shoes, aching joints fade into something soft, something clean. So, while medieval life may have been hard, it was never without care. They didn't have luxury soaps or glittering bathtubs, but they had rosemary and lavender. They didn't have dental floss, but they had mint and walnut twigs. They didn't have shampoo, but they had vinegar, egg yolks, and patience. The tools of medieval cleanliness were humble, but they were intentional, thoughtful, rooted in nature and necessity, and above all, they worked. Let's leave the quiet of the countryside behind for a moment. Picture instead a town square, not grand, not bustling like a capital city, but alive with sound and scent. Children dart between stalls, a blacksmith hammers in the distance, and at the far end of the market street, smoke curls gently from a stone chimney. It's not from a bakery. It's coming from a building whose doors stay open well past sunset. A place where townsfolk from all walks of life gather, a place filled with steam, with laughter, with whispers. The public bathhouse, a fixture of medieval urban life, and for a time, believe it or not, one of the cleanest places in town. Or so they claimed. Let's step inside, slowly, quietly. Just as you are no rush, the stone steps are damp underfoot, and the wooden door creaks on its hinges. Inside, your skin prickles with the sudden warmth. The air is thick with steam, herbs, and if we're honest, a touch of something sour. Roaring fire feeds the boiler in the back. A large wooden tub sits in the center, surrounded by smaller washing benches. Robes hang on hooks. The floor is covered with reeds to soak up spills. Voices echo softly across the tile and stone. This is not just a bath. This is a ritual, a routine, a refuge. In many towns and cities during the Middle Ages, especially in Western and Central Europe, Public bathhouses were common gathering spots. Some were humble family-run affairs. Others, particularly in places like Paris, London, or Frankfurt, were large, complex establishments offering various rooms, a warm room, a hot room, a cold plunge, and even private chambers. Think of it as a medieval version of the spa, or a social club with hot water bathhouses, or stews, as they were sometimes called in England, were often open to both men and women, though in different rooms or at different times of day. In some areas, mixed bathing was allowed, especially in earlier centuries, and this caused quite a stir. Among more conservative minds, let's take a typical evening visit. You arrive at the bathhouse after a long day. Maybe you're a merchant, a baker, or perhaps a tired traveler. You pay a small fee at the entrance, usually a few coins, and hand your clothes to an attendant. These bathhouse workers, called balneators in some Latin texts, might also provide you with a towel, a rough bar of soap, and a wooden bucket for rinsing. Inside, the space is warm and dim. The walls sweat with condensation. Buckets of hot water are passed down the line. You rinse, first scrubbing off the city grime with soap made of tallow or lye. Then you soak. Some bathhouses provided food and drink. You might sip spiced wine while your muscles loosen. Someone strums a lute in the corner. It's almost festive. But remember, this wasn't just about comfort. Bathing was considered good for the body and the soul. Medical theory at the time, particularly the ideas of Galen and Hippocrates, held that balancing the body's humors was essential to health. Bathing, sweating, and purging were all part of this process. Many bathhouses even employed physicians or barber surgeons, offering treatments alongside your soak, cupping, bloodletting, or applying herbal salves. But of course, where people gathered, rumor followed, and bathhouses became the subject of both fascination and scandal, because they weren't just clean places, they were social spaces, and that meant rules were often bent. Mixed gender bathing, as we mentioned, was sometimes allowed. Robes were optional. Privacy was rare. And while many came simply to wash or rest aching bodies, others came for company. By the late Middle Ages, particularly around the 14th and 15th centuries, bathhouses gained a somewhat risked reputation. Some were associated with prostitution or secret liaisons. In cities like London, these stews were regulated under law, with rules about which bathhouses could operate and under what circumstances. In fact, church authorities grew increasingly wary of these places. Preachers warned of temptation. In the Steam, pamphlets described bathhouses as dens of sin, though often in language so exaggerated it only fueled curiosity. Still, many bathhouses thrived despite the warnings. They were convenient, clean, relatively speaking, and affordable for people who had no private facilities at home, which was most of the population. They were a necessary part of weekly or monthly hygiene. And, for some, they were a luxury. In Central Europe, especially in the Germanic regions, bath culture reached its peak. In the late medieval period, cities like Nuremberg, Cologne, and Prague had sophisticated bathhouses with heated rooms, marble tubs, and elaborate drainage systems. In Nuremberg, for example, a bathhouse might have 2 stories, separate chambers for men and women, and even windows of horn or oiled parchment to let in filtered light. These weren't hastily thrown together structures. They were investments. Bathhouse owners kept detailed logs. Some even advertised their services, boasting of the quality of their herbs, the clarity of their water, or the gentleness of their attendants. Yet by the 16th century, this golden age of public bathing began to fade. What happened? Well, a few things. First came the plague. The Black Death in the 14th century led to widespread fear of contagion. People began to worry that heat and steam opened the pores and let disease in. Bathhouses, once seen as sources of health, were now viewed by some as dangerous. Then came changing medical theories. Some scholars now argued that washing too often was unhealthy, that it stripped the body of essential oils or weakened the skin. Dry washing using linen, cloths, powders, or even perfumes grew in popularity. And of course, the Reformation played a role. Protestant Reformers were often critical of anything they saw as indulgent. The bathhouse, with its warmth, its chatter, its soft pleasures, became suspect. Many were closed, others were repurposed or fell into disrepair by the end of the 16th century. Public bathing had declined across much of Europe. Only in some parts of the Islamic world, and later in countries like Japan and Finland, did communal bathing traditions continue without interruptions. Till, for a time, centuries even, the public bathhouse was a cornerstone of urban life. It was where you caught up on gossip, where you soothed your back after market day, where you listened to music while soaking sore feet, where you met friends or enemies, or maybe someone new. It was steamy, noisy, aromatic, a little scandalous, and entirely human. So, if you ever find yourself walking the damp streets of a medieval town in your dreams, follow the steam. Listen for laughter echoing off tile walls. Step inside carefully. Let the warm air wrap around you like a woolen cloak, and remember, long before indoor plumbing or scented candles, this was bathing. Not private, not perfect, but deeply, deeply communal. We've passed through steamy bathhouses, chilly monastic halls, and moral sermons thick with incense. Now let's drift into the quieter world of medicine. Not the sleek, sterile kind you know today, but something much humbler, more earthy, more uncertain. This chapter is not about surgical tools or remedies whispered in Latin. It's about the body and what people in the Middle Ages thought it needed, especially when it came to keeping clean. Let's light a candle, open a dusty herbal manuscript, and enter a world where cleanliness was never quite what it seemed. To begin, we need to understand how medieval people saw the body. They didn't imagine it in terms of cells, bacteria, or blood types. Instead, the dominant medical theory of the time was based on the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each humor was linked to different elements: air, water, earth, and fire, and to different moods and temperaments. A healthy person was someone in balance. Too much of one humor, illness. Followed, here's where bathing comes in. Bathing, sweating, purging, all were considered ways to rebalance the humors, not just to clean the body, but to restore its inner harmony. So, if you are melancholic, too much black bile, your physician might recommend a warm bath with calming herbs. If you are choleric, too much yellow bile, cooling waters and aromatic oils might help soothe your fiery disposition. But there were rules, many rules. Let's imagine a medieval doctor. He's not wearing a lab coat, instead a long robe, perhaps a soft cap. His fingers are stained with ink and herbs. His breath smells faintly of rosemary and wine. He sits beside a noble woman, pale and anxious. Her skin itches. She feels feverish. He opens a heavy book, perhaps one by Galen, the ancient Roman physician whose ideas still ruled medicine. He nods gently, then prescribes a bath. Not just any bath. It must be lukewarm, infused with chamomile, sage, and lavender. It must be taken in the early evening, not too soon after eating, and she must rest afterward in a room warmed by coals wrapped in linen to prevent the cold air from re-entering the pores. Yes, pores. Let's pause therein. The medieval worldview, pores were gateways. Open them too wide, and you invited disease. Sweat in moderation was good. It released bad humors. But excessive heat, hot baths taken too often, that was dangerous. Doctors warned that overbathing could weaken the body, make it vulnerable to miasmas. Foul airs believed to carry illness. They believed that disease was spread not by invisible germs, but by corrupted air, and freshly bathed skin was considered more absorbent, more exposed. Even when bathing was advised, it was done with caution. A balance again, always. A balance. Now, let's look at soap. Yes, they had it. Not the bubbly, flowery stuff we use today, but basic, earthy, handmade blocks. In early medieval Europe, soap was often made by boiling animal fat, like beef or goat tallow, with lye, a strong alkaline substance made from ashes. The result, a greasy grayish bar with a sharp scent. Effective, yes, pleasant, not always. In wealthier households, especially in Italy and southern France, soap making evolved into an art. They began to use olive oil instead. Of animal fat, added herbs, flower extracts, and even honey. These soaps were smoother, gentler, and far more expensive in fact. By the 12th century, cities like Marseille had become known for their luxury soaps. Merchants carried them in small wooden boxes wrapped in linen scented with rosemary or lemon balm. Still, soap was not used in the same way we use it now. People didn't scrub their whole bodies daily. They might wash their hands, faces, and feet, or use a cloth soaked in warm water. With a bit of soap rubbed in, baths themselves were often taken without soap, entirely just hot water and herbs. Soap was for dirtier jobs, laundry, shaving, or the rare full body clean before a feast, wedding, or holy day, but there were other ways to stay fresh. Let's talk about powders, perfumes, and linenized linen. It might surprise you, but in some parts of medieval Europe, people changed their undergarments more often than they bathed clean. Linen pressed and rubbed with herbs was believed to pull oils and dirt away from the skin. You might sleep in it or wear 2 layers during the day and swap the inner one at night. For the wealthier classes, rose water or vinegar rinses were popular. You dip a cloth, wring it out, and gently wipe the skin. No rinsing needed, no soap required in winter, when full bathing was uncomfortable or impractical. This was the go-to method. And for the fashionable elite, perfumes and scented sachets stuffed with lavender cloves or dried citrus peel were pinned into sleeves or tucked inside collars. Let's not forget about hair. Contrary to myth, medieval people didn't all have greasy, matted hair. They washed it, though less frequently, and used a variety of rinses. A common mixture might include rainwater, collected fresh boiled rosemary or nettle, a dash of vinegar for shine, and sometimes beer to add body and scent. Hair was combed daily, often with long-toothed combs made from wood or bone, and lice were a regular nuisance, yes, but so were remedies. Garlic, pennyroyal, and even crushed wormwood were used to repel pests. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, at least for a while. Now back to the big question. How clean was clean enough? For many medieval people, the answer depended on their class, profession, and geography. A peasant who worked the fields from dawn to dusk might bathe only during high summer, when the river was warm. A merchant in Venice might visit a bathhouse weekly, scrub down with olive oil and citrus, then rinse in cool water before a business meeting. A noblewoman in a northern castle might settle for daily face washing and weekly hair rinses, depending on the season. But across all walks of life, there was an understanding that hygiene mattered, even if their methods were different. Even if their beliefs about disease and health were sometimes flawed, cleanliness was not about eliminating bacteria. It was about comfort, modesty, balance, and yes, sometimes ritual. Let's end this chapter with a small scene. A quiet evening. A woman sits by the fire. Her feet ache. She removes her shoes, rolls up her skirts. Her daughter brings a copper basin filled with warm water. Steam curls into the air. She dips a cloth, linen, coarse but clean, and gently washes her face, then her hands, then her arms. She sighs, not in vanity, not in indulgence, but in relief. Outside, the night grows colder. Inside, the flicker of flame, the scent of dried mint in the basin, and the soft hush of water on skin remind us, even in the darkest centuries, people longed for comfort, for cleanliness, for care, just as we do. When we think of medieval royalty, we often picture shining crowns, velvet robes, and long echoing halls of marble and gold. But underneath all that splendor was skin, hair, sweat. Smell. Kings and queens weren't immune to dirt. They sweated under their brocade garments, itched inside their fur-lined collars, and sometimes, just like their peasants, smelled less than fresh. Yet despite the grime of the age, medieval royalty cared deeply about appearance. Cleanliness in their world wasn't just about health or comfort. It was about power. It was about control. And it was most certainly about ritual. So tonight we'll step quietly through the royal chambers. We'll tiptoe past the guards and into the washrooms of queens, into the bathhouses of emperors, and discover the strange, fussy, and surprisingly thoughtful ways in which medieval rulers dealt with the mésanges of the human body. Let's begin with Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and later crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. In the year 800, despite living over 1,000 years ago, Charlemagne had a reputation for bathing. More often than most of his contemporaries, he had a fondness for hot baths, especially those in Aachen, where natural hot springs bubbled up from the earth, so much so, in fact, that he built his imperial palace near them, so he could soak with his family and guests. One chronicler wrote that Charlemagne would often bathe in public, chatting with friends and nobles in the steamy water, as if it were a medieval spa. And these weren't quick dips either. These were long therapeutic soaks. This tells us something important in the royal mind. Bathing could be social, even political. It wasn't shameful. It was a sign of status. But as centuries passed and Christian influence grew stronger, bathing took on new meaning, more caution, more modesty, and sometimes suspicion. Let's move forward in time to Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen of both France and England. In the 12th century, she was cultured, educated, and raised in the warm southern region of Aquitaine, where bathing traditions were older and often influenced by Roman and Arabic customs. At her court, it's believed that regular bathing and perfuming were encouraged. She and her ladies may have used scented oils, washed with rosewater, and worn fresh linen regularly. But Eleanor was unusual. Most queens, especially those in colder climates like England or the German states, bathed far less frequently. Still, they didn't ignore hygiene. Instead, they relied on ritual cleansing, washing hands before meals, wiping faces with perfumed cloths, or using herbal powders under the arms and along the neck. Queens often had servants, sometimes called chambers, whose job was to prepare warm basins of water, scrub cones clean, and gently rub their skin with damp cloths. And while we might find it odd, they would also frequently change their clothes, especially the underlayers. In fact, one 15th century noblewoman reportedly changed her linen 3 times a day, more than some people today. Now, let's visit a very different kind of monarch. Louis the Ninth of France, also known as Saint Louis. He reigned in the 13th century and was known for both his piety and his discomfort with bodily pleasure. It's said he bathed only twice a year, once at Easter and once at Christmas, and even then reluctantly. Why? Because bathing in some circles had become linked with sin, warm water, nakedness, pleasure, all things that saints were supposed to avoid. For Louis, to be holy meant to be uncomfortable, and a fragrant bath was too close to vanity for his liking. But that doesn't mean he didn't care about health or cleanliness. He simply expressed it differently, through fasting, prayer, and ritual purification. So, while Louis might not have scrubbed his back often, he still considered spiritual cleanliness far more important. And yet, for all the piety, there were royals who went the other way entirely. Take Isabella of Castile, Queen of Spain in the 15th century. Legends say she wore the same dress for years and claimed she would only bathe once her kingdom was freed from the Moors. That might be exaggeration, but what it shows is how some rulers associated dirt with devotion, with sacrifice. Others, like her daughter Catherine of Aragon, who later married England's King Henry VIII, brought more refined habits. Catherine was known for her neatness, and she brought over Spanish customs of facial cleansing, linen changing, and even the occasional bath. Henry VIII too bathed now and then, especially in his younger, more athletic years. But by the Tudor period, English monarchs had already shifted away from full bathing. Instead, they relied on sweat rooms, vinegar rinses, and powders, and the royal court stank. Accordingly, one visitor described Queen Elizabeth's court as magnificent but pungent. Even the queen, famed for her red wigs and pearly skin, is believed to have bathed infrequently. She masked odors with perfumes and kept her face pale with lead-based makeup, a decision that probably did her more harm than any lack of soap. So did medieval royals care about hygiene? The answer is yes. But in different ways than we might expect. They didn't bathe daily. They didn't scrub themselves with antibacterial soap. But they did wash their hands and faces regularly, change their linen underclothes, use herbal powders and oils, comb their hair meticulously, and often cleanse themselves before religious festivals or major events. To them, cleanliness was as much about ritual and symbolism as it was about smell or health. Let's step quietly now into a royal chamber. It's early evening. A queen sits near the fire, her shoes off, her hair loose. A servant brings in a silver basin filled with warm lavender water. She dips her fingers and then her wrists, then gently presses a cloth to her cheeks. No soap, no tub, just steam scent. A pause in the day. Somewhere down the hall, her husband, the king, is having his boots scraped and his feet rinsed with wine and vinegar. He doesn't bathe often, but tonight is a feast. And even kings need to smell presentable under the furs and gold. From Charlemagne's public hot springs to Elizabeth I's perfumed sleeves, medieval royalty lived in tension between comfort and austerity, between image and ritual, between tradition and practicality. May not have been clean by our standards, but in their own way they tried. And isn't that what hygiene really is? A reflection of what we believe, what we fear, and what we hope others see in us. In the hushed corridors of medieval monasteries, life moved slowly. Clocks didn't tick here, bells did. Bells that tolled for prayer, for sleep, for meals, for silence. And in these sacred spaces, cleanliness wasn't just about comfort. It was about discipline, order, and the soul. Tonight, we turn away from castles and royalty and step into stone cloisters, candlelit refectories, and echoing abbey baths. We'll drift through gardens where herbs were grown, not for taste, but for purity. We'll stand by wooden wash basins and feel the chill of morning routines. Silent, repetitive, devout, because while the outside world muddled through filth and rumor, monks and nuns developed some of the most structured approaches to hygiene in the medieval world. Let's take off our shoes, lower our voices, and walk barefoot into the ritual world of monastic cleanliness. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, became the blueprint for thousands of monastic communities across Europe. Told monks when to eat, when to sleep, when to work. And yes, even when and how to wash, while it never prescribed full-body bathing as a daily practice. The rule did emphasize moderation and care for the body. Benedict wrote that the needs of the sick and the elderly should be prioritized. If someone needed a bath, they should be allowed to take one, not for pleasure, but for health. And so began a paradox that would last for centuries. Monasteries, even while embracing poverty and denial of the flesh, often had the best bathing facilities in the medieval world. Picture this: a 12th century Cistercian abbey in England, gray stone, low arches. Down one corridor lies the lavatorium, the washing room. Here before every meal monks line up. In silence, a narrow trough runs along the wall, fed by a gravity-driven water system from nearby springs. Bronze taps drip into stone basins, their soap root growing in the garden. Nearby, an early form of natural cleanser. Each monk washes his hands, rolls down his sleeves, and wipes them on a shared linen cloth hanging nearby. No talking, just watercloth movement over and over again. Like many medieval towns which had no plumbing and little coordination, monasteries were often engineering marvels. Cistercians in particular were brilliant with water. They built aqueducts, sluices, and piping systems to bring fresh water into their cloisters and carry away waste. Some had heated bathhouses with warm stone benches, steam channels, and wooden tubs. Others had latrines with running water below them. Primitive but effective sewage systems. Monastic architects understood something crucial: clean water equals healthy monks, equals better prayer after all. A monk could not recite psalms with a sick stomach. He could not meditate with lice chewing his scalp. He could not copy scripture with fingers so dirty They smudged the ink. Monks weren't always clean in the way we imagine today, but they were ordered, and order was its own kind of purity. Hair was often shaved into a tonsure, not just for humility, but for practicality. It made lice easier to spot and removed the need for regular hairstyling. Nails were trimmed, habits were washed, and bedding was aired. Some orders even required monks to bathe several times a year, 4, 5, or more, depending on the climate and rules. This may not sound like much, but compared to peasants who bathed once a year, it was practically luxurious. Nuns too lived by these codes, though their records are thinner. Women in cloistered communities often had similar routines. Their convents had washrooms and latrines, soap made from lye and herbs, and even bath days. In some Benedictine nunneries, it was required that nuns bathe before major religious festivals, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. They would gather in small groups, assist each other with hair washing, and wear linen veils while drying by the hearth. Silence remained important, but among women, especially those who lived together for decades, there must have been laughter too, gentle teasing, quiet smiles, moments of warmth that broke through the rules. For these women, bodily care was not vanity, it was obedience. But not all monastic bathing was serene. In some monasteries, the bathhouse became a place of temptation. Church leaders warned against communal baths, fearing that even the purest souls might be led astray by the sight of naked flesh. One bishop in the 13th century wrote sternly about brothers who bathed too frequently and with too many companions. He advised more modesty, more discipline. Over time, some orders shut down their bathhouses entirely. Others allowed only solitary bathing. Some allowed none at all, substituting it with dry cloth rub-downs or vinegar-soaked linens to wipe under the arms. As spiritual ideals hardened, the body became more suspicious. Yet through all this, monastic hygiene endured. Why? Because monks weren't just praying for themselves. They were praying for everyone, for kings and commoners, for cities and saints. To do that, they needed to stay healthy. Many monasteries became hospitals during plagues. They boiled water, grew herbs, and practiced basic cleanliness, while cities fell into chaos. Their emphasis on order and cleanliness laid the groundwork for later medical practices, and even some early forms of public health. And so, in the quiet rhythm of monastic life, hygiene became more than habit. It became holy. Think of a monk rising before dawn, slipping on his robe in the cold, stone dark. He steps into the lavatorium, pours water over his hands, washes not just the skin, but the soul. He eats, he prays, he works in the garden. And before bed, he washes again, rinsing the day from his fingertips, letting the water carry away pride, hunger, anger, everything that clouded the spirit. This was the medieval monastic cleanse. Not a bubble bath, not a scented soak, but a ritual of humility, silence, and renewal. So the next time you imagine monks as scruffy, smelly hermits, pause. They may have been more orderly, more thoughtful, and more hygienic than many nobles. They may not have smelled like roses, but they moved through life with a rhythm that left space for water, space for care, and in a world where chaos and dirt were everywhere, that was no small thing. Close your eyes for a moment and think of the Middle Ages. What do you see? A peasant caked in mud, scratching his lice-ridden scalp. Noblewoman in a brocade gown, powdered but unwashed, dabbing her nose with a perfumed cloth. A city street filled with slop rats and people who haven't seen a bath in years. The Middle Ages, as we imagine them, often feel filthy. Time when nobody bathed, everyone stank, and hygiene was considered sinful. But what if much of that image is simply wrong tonight? We'll take a quiet walk through the myths, not to judge the past, not to mock it, but to gently lift the layers of fiction and see what truth lies beneath. Because when it comes to medieval bathing habits, the dirty truth might be that they weren't quite as dirty as we think. Let's begin with one of the most enduring claims. People in the Middle Ages never bathed. It's a favorite line in TV shows, jokes, even history books, but the evidence doesn't quite support it is daily bathing. As we know it today, with scented soap, hot water on demand, and a private tub, didn't exist for most people, but bathing in some form, that was very much part of medieval life records, show that communal bathhouses were common in many towns. Cities, especially in the earlier medieval period, charters from cities like Paris and London mention the regulation of bathhouses, when they could operate, how much they could charge, and how to separate the sexes. Even rural villagers had access to streams, barrels, and small wooden tubs. They may not have bathed often, but they weren't entirely unwashed either. Then there's the myth that bathing was considered sinful, or dangerous. This one has a grain of truth, but like many old stories, it's grown distorted over time. In the early Middle Ages, influenced by Roman customs, many people believed in the benefits of public bathing. Hot baths, cold plunges, and sweat rooms. These weren't just for hygiene. They were social spaces, relaxation, rituals. But by the later medieval period, particularly after the Black Death and various waves of disease, attitudes began to shift. Doctors and theologians started warning against baths, not because they thought water itself was evil, but because they believed it opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to bad air or miasma. And yes, in some religious circles, nudity and shared baths began to be seen as morally risky, but this wasn't universal. Plenty of people continued to bathe. In fact, many noble households had private bath chambers, small rooms with wooden tubs where servants would pour warm water from kettles and help prepare herbal rinses. Some even had bathing rituals after long hunts, before weddings, or during feasts. Wasn't about never bathing, it was about when, where, and how safely. Another stubborn myth. Soap didn't exist in the Middle Ages. Not quite true. Medieval soap wasn't like the scented bars we know today, but people did make and use basic forms of soap, often from animal fat, lye, and ash shit. Could be harsh, yes, but it worked. Soap was produced in parts of Spain, France, and the Middle East. There's even evidence of imported soap. Aleppo soap, made from olive oil, exported across the Mediterranean. We also find references in household accounts of soap for laundry and soap for washing the body. And when soap wasn't available, people used alternatives, like clay brine vinegar, or even sand to scrub the skin. So, no, they weren't rubbing onions on their armpits. They had tools, they had methods, they cared. What? About perfume. It's often assumed that people in the Middle Ages doused themselves in scent to mask the stink of never bathing. There's some truth here, but again, the full story is more nuanced. Perfumes and scented waters were common, especially among the wealthy. But they weren't just for masking odor. They were part of medical theory, linked to health and balance of the humors. Rose water, lavender, rosemary. They weren't just lovely. They were medicinal. People believed these scents could ward off disease, calm the mind, or protect the spirit. You might walk into a medieval chamber and find clothes perfumed with dried herbs, shoes filled with sweet-smelling moss, or a basin of rose water for guests to rinse their hands. Wasn't about hiding filth. It was about creating a kind of sensory harmony. And then there's the biggest myth of all. People didn't care about hygiene. This might be the most unfair assumption of all. They did care deeply, but their understanding of hygiene was simply different. They believed in balance, not sterility. In caring for the humors, not eliminating every germ, which they didn't know existed. Washed their hands before meals. They combed their hair. They tended to wounds. They removed lice. They cared for their feet. They scrubbed, they scraped, they aired out bedding and swept floors. Not all the time, not obsessively, not perfectly, but they tried. And we must remember, this was a world without plumbing, electricity, antibacterial soap, or disposable towels. Hygiene had to be a community effort, and it was at churches, in bathhouses, in the rules of monasteries, and in the customs passed down through families. Even the way people cleaned their homes tells us something. In towns and villages, sweeping was a regular task Floors were scattered with straw and herbs, not just to mask odors, but to absorb mess and repel insects. Housewives would boil water for washing soak, linens and urine for bleaching, and scrub pewter cups with sand to keep them shining. Cleanliness was work. It took time, it took wood, water, labor, but they did it. The idea that medieval people were all smelly, lazy, and unaware of basic hygiene, that's more of a modern fairy tale than anything they ever believed themselves. Why do these myths persist? Partly because of later propaganda, especially from the Renaissance and Victorian eras. Those periods often looked back at the Middle Ages as dark, ignorant, and dirty to make themselves look more advanced by comparison. And partly because we like simple contrasts. We like the story of then versus now, of ignorance versus enlightenment, but the truth is Messier people. Of the past weren't stupid. They were doing the best they could with what they had and what they knew, and sometimes their practices were surprisingly effective even by today's standards. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, let's gently rinse off the myths. Let's replace the image of the filthy medieval peasant with something more accurate. A tired woman boiling water over a fire to wash her baby. A monk scrubbing his hands in a stone basin before prayer. A nobleman soaking in a wooden tub filled with lavender and rosemary. Not perfect, not sterile, but far from careless. They lived in a world where dirt was everywhere, but they never stopped trying to stay clean, and maybe that's all any of us can really do. By now you've likely come to see that medieval hygiene was more nuanced than you may have imagined, far from spotless, yet far from savage. But among the many layers of medieval life, few institutions better reflect the tangled relationship between cleanliness, community, and controversy than the public bathhouse tonight. We drift quietly through the steamy, echoing halls of these now vanished spaces, where hot water met whispered secrets, and the pursuit of purity sometimes slid into the shadows of sin, because in medieval Europe, taking a bath was never just about getting clean. Sometimes it was also about getting noticed, or getting into trouble. Let's gently enter the story of the bathhouse part, spa part, social club part, scandalous rumor. Mill and always a reflection of its time. Let's begin with the setting. A typical medieval bathhouse, perhaps in a city like Nuremberg, Paris, or London around the 13th or 14th century. You wouldn't find stark white tiles or piped-in spa music here. Instead, imagine timber-framed buildings with steep rooftops and smoke wafting from their chimneys. Signs hanging outside often featured symbols of cleanliness. A comb, a towel, a steaming cauldron, or a barrel overflowing with water. Inside you'd encounter the sharp, heady scent of steamed herbs, lavender, thyme, and rosemary, meant to relax the body and ward off disease. At the heart of the building were large wooden tubs, sometimes sunk into the floor, sometimes perched above heated stone. Slab servants would carry kettles of boiling water from the hearth, carefully mixing them with cold until the temperature was just right. These tubs weren't private. They were shared. Couples might bathe together, friends might sit side by side chatting softly as they soaked away the dust of the streets. A server, yes, sometimes called a badhusmädchen or bathmaid, might bring drinks, food, or scented cloths to freshen the skin. It sounds relaxing, doesn't it? And for many it was. The bathhouse was a rare moment of warmth and comfort in a world where most homes were cold, cramped, and dim. It was a place to wash, but also to rest, to socialize, even to flirt. And therein lay the problem, you see. As bathhouses became more common and more popular, they began to attract attention, not just from bathers, but from moralists, clergy, and city officials. They started to worry, because while the public bathhouse was technically a place for hygiene, it quickly became known as a space where boundaries blurred, where nudity was normalized, and where private behavior could happen in very public ways. Let's pause and consider something quietly. For much of medieval Europe, gender segregation in bathhouses was a point of debate. Some towns had strict rules. Certain Hours for men, others for women. In other places, mixed bathing was not only common, but expected. Married couples might bathe together. Friends of opposite genders might share a tub. And yes, occasionally strangers might meet beneath the steam, and not just for conversation. By the 14th century, bathhouses in many cities began to develop a reputation, not only as places of rest, but as thinly veiled brothels in some towns. The same women who served food and poured wine might also offer more intimate services. The bathhouse became, for better or worse, a symbol of moral confusion, a place to get clean, and yet a place of impurity. Lines were slippery, just like the wet stone floor. Cities responded in different ways. In Frankfurt, regulations were introduced to prevent indecent behavior in bathhouses. In Paris, some bathhouses were forced to close, entirely accused of spreading both sin and disease. In London, the famous stews of Southwark public baths, situated on the south bank of the Thames, became synonymous with vice. Despite multiple efforts by the Crown and Church to regulate them, the stews flourished, mixing hygiene with hedonism in equal measure. Even the Catholic Church got involved, though not inherently opposed to bathing. The monasteries, after all, maintained their own strict rules for cleanliness. The Church worried deeply about what happened in those shadowy steam room. Sermons warned against the temptation of mixed bathing. Clerics urged the faithful to bathe only in private, or only out of necessity. Some even declared public bathhouses to be gateways to sin, and encouraged cities to demolish them. And during outbreaks of plague, fears grew worse. Bathing, once a symbol of cleanliness, was now seen by some as a threat. A place where skin opened, disease entered, and morality broke down. The warm water, once inviting, became a source of suspicion. But despite all this, despite the warnings, regulations, and reputation, bathhouses continued to thrive. Why? Because people needed them. Life in medieval cities was harsh. Streets were muddy, homes were smoky, clothes were worn and reused. A bathhouse was one of the few places where a person could feel, if only briefly, clean, renewed. Even those who opposed them privately likely visited them quietly. Even critics who denounced them might enjoy a soak when no one was watching. They were part of the urban rhythm. Just like markets, churches, and taverns, and even in the countryside, small-scale bathing rituals continued. A wooden tub behind a curtain, a servant warming water over the fire, a few drops of lavender to make it special. Idea that the bathhouse was either wholly virtuous or wholly corrupt misses the point. It was both. It was neither. It was human. Let's drift now to a quieter bathhouse, far from the scandals of the cities. Perhaps a monastic bath maintained by Benedictine monks. Here bathing was modest, ritualistic, once or twice a month, as dictated by the rule of St. Benedict, quietly, humbly, with no excess. No scandal. Or perhaps to the Islamic world, where bathing was not just a custom, but a spiritual act. In cities like Cordoba, Baghdad, and Cairo, the hammam, a type of public bath, was part of daily life. Built with beautiful domes, marble floors, and flowing water, hammams were seen as essential to both health and purity. Here, bathing was a sacred rhythm. Washing the body was preparation for prayer. Cleanliness was not just physical, it was spiritual, communal, reverent. This contrast reminds us that ideas of bathing, of what's pure and what's impure, differed across cultures, even within the same century. And even within Europe, no two bathhouses were exactly alike. As we close this chapter, let's soften the image of the medieval bathhouse, not as a den of filth or debauchery, not as a sterile paradise, but as something humana, place of steam and story, of comfort and conflict, of bare skin and whispered laughter, of aching muscles, warmed bones, and fleeting connection. Maybe it was a scandal. Maybe it was salvation. Or maybe it was just a tub full of water and someone needing a moment of peace. Sleep gently tonight and imagine the steam rising softly from the stones, a flicker of torchlight on wet skin, the sound of water pouring from a copper kettle, and voices quiet, distant, echoing off the wooden beams. Bathhouse is gone now, but the memory lingers warm, human, complicated. And so we come to the final chapter tonight. We'll drift through the last, steamy corridors of medieval cleanliness and step gently into the changing world that followed. A world where the public bathhouse faded and something more private, more refined and perhaps more modern began to take shape. This is the story of how bathing left the shared tubs of cities and found its way, slowly, quietly, back into the home, from mud and buckets to marble and brass, from suspicion and scandal to solitude. Let's begin, as always, softly, as we've wandered together through centuries of dirt, sweat, steam, and soap. You may have noticed a shift, a gradual but unmistakable turning of the tide. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the idea of communal bathing, the once popular bathhouses that had filled cities with steam and chatter, had begun to vanish across much of Europe. They weren't gone in an instant, but like the fading scent of rosemary in a cooling tub, they began to disappear from daily life. Why? Historians often point to three key reasons. One, disease. The recurring outbreaks of plague, syphilis, and pox led many to fear that warm, open pores were dangerous. Physicians warned that water could carry sickness, that soaking, especially with others, left the body vulnerable. The bathhouse, once a place of healing, became a place of risk to morality. The church, ever vigilant, continued its campaign against what it saw as the slippery ethics of mixed bathing. Bathhouses were places where men and women mingled freely, often unclothed. The whispers of sin, already loud in the 14th century, became shouts in the 15th and 16th. 3. Privacy and class. As the wealthy grew wealthier and cities grew more crowded, the elite began to step back from communal life. They built homes with private spaces, bedrooms, studies, and eventually bathing rooms. Cleanliness became a marker of status. The poor might wash in rivers or with cloths, but the rich, they bathed behind closed doors. And so slowly the public bathhouse fell silent. Its doors closed, its tubs dried, its echoes faded, but bathing did not die. It simply evolved. Let's travel now to a quiet estate in England, perhaps around the year 1700. The house is grand, with tall windows and thick stone walls. Inside, candles flicker. A servant pours warm water into a freestanding copper tub, carefully lined with linen. This was not a bath taken every day. Not yet, but it was taken deliberately, in privacy, with care perhaps. There was soap made from animal fat and ash, or even scented oils from abroad. The bather might read or simply sit, letting the warmth soak into tired muscles. Was a new kind of bathing, intimate, individual, and slow, still rare, still special, but becoming more common by the late 18th century. In places like France and Italy, wealthier homes often featured designated bathing rooms. Not quite bathrooms as we know them, but rooms with large basins, spigots, and space for tubs. And with the Industrial Revolution on the horizon, things were about to change even more. Imagine the shift, the invention of indoor plumbing pipes that brought fresh water into the home and carried dirty water away. Hot water tanks, gas heaters, faucets, porcelain tubs. Suddenly the act of bathing wasn't just something you did once a month or on special occasions. It became routine, expected, normal. In the Victorian-era, cities like London, Berlin, and New York began to prioritize public sanitation. Sewers were built, water treatment plants were developed. Entire neighborhoods were redesigned around hygiene, and with this shift came a cultural transformation. Cleanliness was no longer suspicious. It was virtuous. Being clean meant being modern, civilized, responsible. A good citizen kept their home tidy, and their body too. The once controversial bath became not only accepted but admired. But not everyone could afford their own marble tub. For the working class, especially in industrial cities, home bathing was still a challenge. Many lived in crowded tenements with no plumbing, no heating, and no privacy. So public bathing took on a new form. In the 19th century, cities introduced public bathhouses 2.0. Not the scandalous stews of medieval Europe, but clean, state-run facilities. where the poor could bathe. Cheaply or even for free, these were often segregated by gender staffed with attendants, equipped with separate stalls and regulated water temperatures. The goal was clear: promote public health, prevent disease, encourage decency. In a way, the bathhouse had come full circle from a place of pleasure to a place of shame, and now a place of progress. And now, at last, we return to the present where most of us can turn a handle, adjust the heat, and watch water flow from a tap, where we can soak in peace. Close the door and take for granted something that took centuries to become normal, yet even today, echoes of the past remain there. Are communal bathhouses still in use around the world? The onsen of Japan, the hammams of the Middle East, the saunas of Scandinavia, the spas of Hungary and Turkey. In these places, bathing is still a ritual, a social act, a cultural thread that has never been broken. And in our homes, we light candles, add oils, run hot water, and often, without realizing, we recreate the same comfort medieval people once sought: warmth, relief, stillness, a moment away from the cold world. So, what did we learn drifting through this long, strange story? That medieval people weren't as dirty as we were told, that bathing has always been more than physical, that water, hot or cold, in a wooden tub or a marble basin, has always meant something deeper. Care, ritual, renewal. Bathing has been feared and celebrated. It's been scandalous and sacred, and through it all it's remained one of the most human things we do. To step into water, close your eyes, and let the day fall away is timeless. So, dear listener, as we leave behind muddy courtyards and steaming bathhouses, monks with buckets and merchants with scented towels, let's take a quiet moment, a breath. Feel the warmth of the imagined tub, the steam rising from the surface, the hush of a candlelit room, a door closed to the world. Nothing left but water, skin, and silence. Thank you for walking this long, warm path with me. Sleep gently tonight, and perhaps dream of rosemary, warm stone, and the comfort of being clean at last.